Ladies, please welcome Erin Gruwell.
Thank you. I'm already emotional and I haven't even begun. One of the most amazing moments this morning, I had the opportunity to go to a local school here, Madison Elementary. And I got to work with 4th and 5th graders who have had the benefit of Mary Jean's Legacy Project. And there was this darling little boy who was a 5th grader whose family was born in the Sudan. And as he was walking out of the assembly, he looked me up and down and said, are you that lady from the movie? And I said, no. And he says, good, because you look a lot older than that woman. So out of the mouth of babes. But as I was at Madison and meeting all these delicious 4th and 5th graders and young kids from Benjamin Franklin Middle School who were also there as mentors, what I felt like is I was holding up a mirror to my classroom, to my students, and to our story. There are so many similarities, so many different shapes and sizes. And as I looked at these students and realized as a teacher who teaches poetry, that if a rose is a rose is a rose, a kid is a kid is a kid. And with all those different shapes and sizes and all of these kids representing this new America, that each and every one of the kids in these 3 counties and all of the United Way serves, that each of those kids deserve a voice, an advocate, and somebody who believes in them, someone who believes that they're not invisible, that they're not on the margins. And so our stories are very similar. When I walked into Wilson High, I walked into a room with 150 14-year-olds. And what they had in common is that these 150 14-year-olds hated reading, they hated writing. They'd never picked up a book and read it from cover to cover, never sat on their daddy's lap and read about green eggs and ham or identified Where's Waldo. And all of these kids had separated themselves into comfort zones based on race, the side of the street they came from, the country of their origin, the God that they prayed to. And I realized that they hated one another. And the only thing that seemed to bring these students together in perfect harmony was they really hated me, this annoying, perky cheerleader from hell wearing polka dots and pearls, hoping to transform that classroom into a place of learning. And I walked in on that first day having no clue what sat before me. I quickly found out in our city there was 126 murders in 1 year. Imagine that. 126 kids who were angry and miserable. And so they picked up a spray can and wrote on a wall. Or they picked up their fist and tried to hit someone. Or worse yet, many of these kids picked up a used .38 special handgun and shot someone. So by the time my students were 14 years old, they knew what it felt like to go to funerals, to bury a friend or a father. They knew what it felt like to walk through the streets feeling like they had a bullseye on their chest, to look over their shoulder and wonder and wish, am I going to be next? And worse yet, most of these kids didn't know if they'd make it home to see that hardworking single mom and kiss her goodnight. Because most of my students grew up in these tiny one-bedroom apartments with those cockroaches and those rats. Most of my kids knew what it felt like to have the lights turned out, have nothing in the fridge, nothing in the cupboards. And most of my kids, by the time they were 14, had given up. They thought we're going to drop out of school by the time we're 15. We'll probably be behind bars by the time we're 16. And we'll probably be 6 feet under by the time we're 18. And they were okay with that. That was their story, that was their script, and they were numb. So I stood before them with chalk on my butt, polka dots and pearls, and this perceived white privilege, and thought, how do I make this matter? How can I give these kids a voice? How can I convince them to put down their fist and that spray can or that gun and pick up a book? Or better yet, pick up a pen and right a wrong. Pick up a pen and rewrite your own ending. So I looked at a little girl in the back corner. Her name was Maria, and she walked in on that first day. She did not come up to my desk and hand me a shiny red apple. Instead, at the age of 14, she walked in with an ankle monitor around her leg, a black eye, and a probation officer. And at the age of 14, this little girl had already been to boot camp and a juvenile hall again and again and again. And in her mind, it was just a matter of time before she screwed up again and was back behind bars, just like her daddy and her granddaddy before that. As she sat in that back corner, brooding, calling me all kinds of naughty names in Spanish, I eventually made a cheat sheet to find out exactly what she was calling me at all times. But I wondered, how do I get this little girl to tell me her story? To tell me about that black eye, to tell me about her father who's rotting in a cell, a maximum security prison. To tell me about that hardworking mom who dropped out of school when she was 7 years old in 2nd grade. To tell me about that mom who got pregnant by the time she was 15. To tell me about that little mom who woke up every morning at the crack of dawn to go clean big, beautiful homes that Maria realized we're never gonna live in, we're never gonna afford. To tell me about that mom who would go off to beautiful hotels just like this one and scrub toilets. Beautiful hotels that Maria realized we're never gonna stay in, we're never gonna afford. To tell me about that mom who on certain nights would go off to a 3rd job and work her fingers to the bones, sewing beautiful dresses that her mama was never gonna wear. I wanted Maria to pick up that pen and tell me that story about that mama, about that daddy, about that legacy. So I went out and got these marble journals, and I hoped that my kids would pick up that pen and just write. So I told them I didn't care about spelling for this assignment or grammar or punctuation. I just wanted them to write. And as I watched Maria scribbling in the back, I thought, maybe she'll tell me about that journey from point A to point B. She was the last one to leave that day, and I looked at her journal, and this is what she wrote on her first assignment. I hate Erin Gruwell. I hate Erin Gruwell, and if I wasn't on probation, I would shank her, ! So at least she got the punctuation right. I grew up in suburbia. I grew up in Newport Beach in California. I didn't even know what shanking was. I just knew it wasn't good. So at that moment, I realized I need to figure out a different way to give my students a voice. If it's not going to be in a book, if it's not going to be on paper, how can I have them trust me to get up and tell me their story? So I decided that we were going to play this game that was anything but a game. And my idea was that somehow, some way, that if I put this piece of tape down the center of my floor, that it would be this gravitational pull. And each and every kid would come to that center of the stage, and by standing there, tell me so much by not saying anything at all. So I put this piece of tape down the center of the floor, divided my class, and I realized I needed to be sneaky and subversive, that if I was going to ask them questions, I was competing against pop culture. The hour upon hour that they played video games that were live and in 3D jumping off a screen. Or the hour upon hour they watched mindless television. Or when they snuck into those darkened movie theaters and for 2 hours escaped the reality. So I would start with songs. I would start with icons. I would start with movies. I would start with anything and everything that reflected pop culture. So when I asked a question about stand in line if you own the new Snoop Dogg CD, everyone was right there. Stand in line if you've seen Boys in the Hood, everyone was there. And even though, just like this community, my students came from different corners of the globe, each and every one of them knew Snoop, they knew that song, they knew that icon. And then I realized, I've got them. And now the questions are going to get real. So when I asked my students, stand on a line if you have ever been poor, every single student stood in that line. And at that moment, I think each and every one of my students realized we've all been poor. We all know in the pit of our stomach what it feels like to be hungry. And to realize that the only meal we're probably going to have today is if we swallow our pride, get to school just a little bit early, and get that breakfast. Or maybe stand in line at lunch and get that free and reduced lunch. And tragically, by the time you're 14 years old and you're in high school and you're trying to fit in and have that identity, most of my kids didn't stand in that line. So most of my kids didn't eat. So each and every one of my kids knew what it felt like to go home and once again, those lights were turned off. How are you supposed to do your homework? How are you supposed to concentrate? How are you supposed to feel good about yourself? So at that moment, asking that question about poverty, each and every one of my kids knew. They knew what it felt like to want things, to wish for things, to ask those hardworking moms for those video games that they knew that they couldn't afford, or those top designer jeans. And if they got those jeans or that video game, what were they going to go without? So for a lot of my kids, they hated Christmas. They hated birthdays because it just represented what they lacked, what they weren't going to have under that Christmas tree. At that moment, I realized I could ask more substantive questions. And I'll never forget, one of the questions I asked was about standing on a line if you've ever been homeless. And unlike all of those questions about pop culture, about those songs and those movies, there was only one person that had the courage and the resiliency to stand in that line. And just like all the other questions, she darted to the line and she stood there. And once she got there, she looked around and she realized, where is everybody? Why am I alone? And at that moment, I saw her look at her feet, and I think she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. I think she just wanted to disappear. Because in that moment, she thought, if they see me, they're going to see my story. They're going to know that I'm that girl that doesn't have a place to live. I don't know where my next meal is coming from. I haven't used deodorant or any kind of feminine hygiene products in a month. And as she stood there in those seconds that must have felt like hours, hoping that this crazy teacher would move on to the next question and she could go back to being invisible, she could go back to the margins. In that moment, out came Tiffany. Out came Tiffany with those beautiful braids. And unlike Sue Ellen, who looked at her feet and just wanted to disappear, who just wanted to go away, Tiffany walked out to the line and she looked at each and every one of us because she wanted us to see her. Because she realized, if you see me, you see my story. And in fact, we had. We had seen her every single day at 4 o'clock like clockwork when Tiffany would stand on that corner of Pacific Coast Highway holding a cardboard box with a little marker she had stolen from art class. And she wrote, "We'll work for food." And Tiffany stood in that corner every single day with this cardboard box and a little tin cup, hoping that some grown man would walk by and feel sorry for her and throw a couple coins in that cup. And maybe, just maybe, when she had enough coins of that cup, she could give it to her daddy and they could get that flea bag motel for a night. And every single day, without fail, she would take those coins to her daddy and he'd smoke it in a crack pipe. So without fail, every day, Tiffany was out on that cold concrete. And she stood there. She wanted us to see her because she wanted us to know that that story was not going to define her. And in that moment, these two strangers had this inexplicable bond, a bond that to this day can never be broken. And suddenly out came Narada. Narada was just this boy who wanted to fit in, who just wanted to play hoops with the other boys, who just wanted those video games and those designer jeans. And he realized, I should have asked my mom for something less expensive, something my mom could afford. And so all of a sudden, these three kids, these perfect strangers, stood in that line. And in that moment, I realized the game is anything but. The questions will get harder. The answers will become more transparent. And these kids are superheroes. These kids have courage and resiliency that I will never know. And I continue to ask questions. Questions about alcoholism in the home, walking on eggshells not to wake up that sleeping giant, because if you did, fisticuffs. Questions about drugs in their community. Who was losing their teeth, who was losing their mind. Questions about bullying. Questions about being poor and being picked on. I will never forget a question I asked, not understanding the magnitude of being a mandated reporter. I asked a question to stand in the line if you've ever faced any kind of abuse. And out walked one of the most beautiful boys I've ever seen. He reminded me of a young boy I saw last night who's from Bosnia, beautiful. And he stood in that line and he looked at me with hate in his heart. I felt like there was smoke coming out of his ears and these daggers coming out of his eyes. And what I did not know then that I know now is that he hated me. He hated every single adult. He hated every single teacher because in his mind, we were rats. We were snitches. Because when he was just a little boy in elementary school, he had learned this game. He learned this game that if he came home and his mama was strung out, that he would take those licks like a man. If he got cuts, he'd wear a long sleeve shirt. If he got bruises, he'd wear a turtleneck. If he got popped in the eye and had a shiner, he would just tell his friends he got that on the football field. So this little boy took those licks and those cuts every single day because in his mind, if he was taking those licks from that mama or her boyfriend who just polished off a bottle of Jim Beam, that at least he could protect those 7 brothers and sisters. So every day he would come home and he'd get knocked around. And then one day when he was in middle school, the ripe old age of 12 years old, he came home and he saw his little sister in the back of a cop car. And he realized, I'm so busy playing the game that I never taught her the game. So my little sister must have gone to school, and that teacher must have seen those bruises. And that teacher must have called Child Protective Services, and Child Protective Services must have called the cops. And now we're all being taken away. And even at the tender age of 12, he realized, I am never going to protect those 7 brothers and sisters again. And tragically, he was right. Because 2 years later, he was standing on a line in my classroom. And he was still taking those licks. He was still taking those licks, but it wasn't from his mama. He'd been in 42 foster homes. 42 foster homes in 2 years. At that moment, I continued to ask questions, and it killed me. What will their answers be? Will they be resilient? Can they change? Can these kids right or wrong? The last question I asked them, I was not prepared for their answer. I asked them to stand in the line if they'd ever buried somebody who had lost their life to senseless gang violence. And 150 kids stood in a line. 150 kids. And the tragic thing is, for each and every one of those kids standing on that line, they'd never read an obituary. Their friends weren't recognized on the nightly news or on the cover of a magazine. And at that moment, I realized I have to give these kids the opportunity to tell their story, to pick up a pen and to not feel so alone in this world. So I decided that I was going to get books that were written by and for and about kids. Kids who actually lived in real wars, not an undeclared one. Kids like Anne Frank, who looked at her attic and watched her friends being let off like sheep to slaughter. And yet every day, this little girl in that tiny little attic told her story. Stories written by young men like Elie Wiesel, who was crammed into a cattle car, rode into Auschwitz-Birkenau, watched his entire family perish in a chimney. And yet he too wrote about it. And I had just discovered a book by a little girl in Bosnia-Herzegovina, a little girl by the name of Zlata Filipovic, who would look out her window and watch her friends being picked up by snipers on their way to school, on their way to get water. So I went to the chair of my English department. I said, is there any way that I can use books written by and for and about kids? Zlata's Diary about a little girl in Sarajevo, or Night by Elie Wiesel, or Anne Frank, which is a classic. And unfortunately, the chair of my English department was very cynical. And in her mind, she had the rap sheets to prove it. Because in her mind, kids were numbers, statistics, and data. And in her mind, all of my kids were the kids who were invisible. The kids who just came from boot camp or juvenile hall. The kids who just came from rehab for crystal meth or crack cocaine. Those kids like Calvin who bounced around from group home to foster home to shelter. All of my students score below the 25th percentile on every standardized test. Their moms were hardworking. Their moms were scared. Their moms were not going to pick up the phone and call me or come to a back-to-school night meeting or bake me brownies. And in retrospect, if they did, I probably shouldn't have eaten them anyways. But in her mind, my kids were never going to read a book from cover to cover. So she went on to say that my kids were dumb. She went on to say that my kids were stupid. And she went on to say that my kids were nothing. And it took me back to a moment in time when I was a little girl and I'd come home and I was crying and my dad said, Erin, sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you. And standing in that teacher's lounge and hearing those words of dumb and stupid and nothing, for the first time in my life, I disagreed with my dad. And I thought, what happens when we tell kids that they are dumb and stupid and nothing and they believe it and they act accordingly? And those words become an albatross around their neck, a horrible self-fulfilling prophecy. So I walked back in my classroom and I looked at all of these beautiful faces, beautiful. And I thought, what happens if I change this paradigm? What if I tell them that they can go anywhere, do anything, and become anyone? And so in that moment, without really thinking it through, I got in my car and I drove to a bookstore and I ordered 150 copies of the Diary of Anne Frank, and 150 copies of Night, and 150 copies about a little girl in Bosnia. And then I stood at that cash register and I panicked. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be paying these books off for 5 years like a student loan. I have maxed out all of my credit cards. I've used up all of my Christmas funds. How can I convince a kid who has never read a book from cover to cover to find themselves? Not to go and rent a movie, not to go get the Cliff Notes, not to download somebody else's paper on the internet, but to pick up a book and to find themselves. So in order to do so, I decided that we were going to have a toast for change. Because in my life, we were always celebrating. When I was 16, I got my driver's license and the keys to a car, and we had that toast. When I was 18, I was headed off to the dorms at the university, and we had that toast. And for all of those landmark occasions, we would raise a glass if somebody graduated, got engaged, got married, had a promotion, bought that house. We were always celebrating. But I realized for those 150 kids, there weren't a lot of celebrations. They weren't raising a glass to celebrate anything. So I decided that I was going to steal a cue from a friend of mine who's a kindergarten teacher, because I am convinced that kindergarten teachers are much more fun. And I have these visions that when kindergarten teachers walk, flowers kind of magically sprout at their feet. And if you've ever seen a kindergarten teacher's bulletin board, it is much more sexy than my bulletin board. So I thought we were taking it back in the day when kids had field trips and they had show and tell. Because for my kids, they missed out on all that. Maybe those proud mamas told them not to show. Or maybe they felt that they had nothing to tell. So I made some silly signs, I blew up some balloons, I got these plastic champagne glasses, filled them with sparkling apple cider. And for the first time, I wanted my kids to walk into that room and to realize that we could wipe that slate clean. We could start over. It didn't matter that they'd been kicked out of every school they ever attended. It didn't matter that they had a 0.5 GPA. It didn't matter what their parents did or, more importantly, didn't do. Starting right then, starting right now, we were going to start over. And Maria Reyes was the first one to walk in, and she looked at my silly signs and these balloons and these plastic champagne glasses and my polka dots and my pearls, and she kind of rolled her eyes and went, Miss G, you really need to stop going to Starbucks because you've had way too many lattes. And in her mind, I was just this annoying, perky cheerleader from hell. And what were these silly signs and these plastic champagne glasses supposed to tell her about life? Because she had gone to school where so many of us as educators were taught to teach to a test. But at that moment, Maria Reyes taught me the most valuable lesson. Don't teach to a test. Teach to me. So in that moment, I was hoping that Maria Reyes would pick up that plastic champagne glass and then pick up that number 2 pencil and bubble in all the right answers. Or pick up that book and read it from cover to cover. Or pick up that ballpoint pen and write that perfect 5-paragraph essay. And then she could moonwalk across the classroom. We would join hands. We would sing Kumbaya. All would be right with the world. Because I was taught to teach to a test. But in that moment, Maria Reyes stepped into my class as a student, and then she became my teacher. And she got very serious, and her toast had nothing to do with that number 2 pencil. It had nothing to do with test scores and statistics and data. And she simply said, I don't want to be pregnant by the time I turn 15 like my mama. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life behind bars like my daddy. And I don't want to be 6 feet under by the time I turn 18 like my cousin. I want to change. And in that moment, this little girl who was so tough, she wasn't so tough after all. And in that moment of being vulnerable and exposed in a room full of her so-called enemies, it gave every other kid this opportunity to stand up and to talk about change. Darius stood up. Darius stood up and he said, I'm tired of being told to act like a man when there is no man in my house to show me or to guide me. And then Henry stood up. And Henry said, I'm tired of sitting on the edge of my bed on this Christmas or this birthday waiting for my deadbeat dad to show up and bring me a present or tell me he loves me. And he never shows up. Kid after kid, they were tired of being poor. They were tired of being picked on. They were tired of eating government cheese. Beautiful young girls were tired of being touched in places they knew they weren't supposed to be touched. And the people touching them had names like Grandpa or Uncle Joe. As each and every kid stood up and made this toast, there was a part of me that panicked. And I thought, I am not a counselor. I am not a therapist. I don't even know how to work that copy machine yet. How am I supposed to help them change? But if I can't, maybe Anne Frank can. So for a brief moment, I want to take you back into my classroom, give you a small glimpse of what it was like when 150 kids found their voice, picked up a plastic champagne glass, and made a toast to change. That they couldn't change that cast of characters, but maybe they could change their direction. Maybe they could change that destiny and maybe start a new legacy. So for a brief moment, once again, I'd like to take you back into room 203.
Okay, guys, gals, listen up. This is what I want you to do. I want each of you to step forward and take one of these Borders bags, which contain the 4 books we're going to read this semester. All right. They're very special books, and they each remind me in some way of each of you. But before you take the books, I want you to take one of these glasses of sparkling cider, and I want each of you to make a toast. We're each gonna make a toast for change. And what that means is, from this moment on, every voice that told you you can't is silenced. Every reason that tells you things will never change disappears. And the person you were before this moment, that person's turn is over. Now it's your turn. Okay? Okay. You ready to get this party going on? What? What's the deal here?
Man, I've had a boyfriend since I was like 11, you know?
I believe you.
Okay, well, I was always the person that was gonna get pregnant before I turned 16 and drop out. Like my mom. Ain't gonna happen.
Nobody ever listens to a teenager. No, everybody thinks you should be happy just because you're young. They don't see the wars that we fight every single day. And one day my war will end. And I will not die. And I will not tolerate abuse from anyone. I am strong.
My mom's kicked me out when I got jumped into the gang life. But I like her to see me graduate. I like to be 18.
Miss G, can I read something from my diary?
That'd be great.
Who is he?
Man, he's been with us since freshman year, fool.
What's his name?
I don't know.
The summer was the worst summer in my short 14 years of life. It all started with a phone call. My mother was crying and begging, asking for more time, as if she were gasping for her last breath of air. She held me as tight as she could and cried. Her tears hit my shirt like bullets and told me we were being evicted. She kept apologizing to me. I thought I have no home. I should have asked for something less expensive at Christmas. On the morning of the eviction, a hard knock on the door woke me up. The sheriff was there to do his job. I looked up at the sky, waiting for something to happen. My mother has no family to lean on, no money coming in. Why bother coming to school or getting good grades if I'm homeless? The bus stops in front of the school. I feel like throwing up. I'm wearing clothes from last year, some old shoes and no new haircut. I kept thinking I'd get laughed at. Instead, I'm greeted by a couple of friends who were in my English class last year. And it hits me, Mrs. Gruwell, my crazy English teacher from last year, is the only person that made me think of hope. Talking with friends about last year's English and our trips, I began to feel better. I received my schedule, and the first teacher is Mrs. Gruwell in room 203. I walk into the room and feel as though all the problems in life are not so important anymore. I am home.
Yes, you are. That was not written by some Hollywood screenwriter in the Hollywood Hills. What that young boy just read was a diary entry written by a young boy, a 14-year-old boy, who stood in line. He wanted everyone to see him and to see his story. And after we did, he went home, a home of a stranger, picked up a pen, and he immortalized his story. And the young boy who plays him is not some actor that you're going to see on Nickelodeon or Disney. He's not going to twerk like Miley Cyrus. The young boy playing Narada is also homeless. I say that to you because there were two words that Narada wrote in the midst of that chaos and in the midst of being so alone and so against the world. He talked about a crazy classroom feeling like home and feeling like walking in that classroom and having hope. And I think that's why we're all here today, is there's a lot of kids. There's a lot of kids that each and every one of you have the opportunity to see, to know, and to understand. You don't have to judge them, but you just have to believe that things can get better. Because I never understood that that young man, Narada, someday was going to fall in love with this beautiful girl in my class, a freedom writer, get down on one knee, propose like his daddy never did, get married like his daddy never did, to have a home like he never had, and to become the father that he always wished he had. So Narada rewrote his own ending. Narada changed that script. And that's exactly what's happening right here in your community. 1 in 8 kids, 1 in 8 individuals, they need a little something. They don't need a handout. They need a hand. They need a hand to hug them, to care, to believe, to give them hope, to give them a home. When I walked into Madison today, I was amazed at the different shapes and sizes I saw. I saw the most beautiful girls from the Sudan, some of the most beautiful boys from Bosnia, these shy, timid girls from Nepal, a young boy from Liberia, another from Somalia, 4 others from Haiti, sitting beside young people from Norway and Sweden and Scandinavia. And what I realized is 4th and 5th graders don't really know a lot about hygiene. They all wanted to hug me, which was great. I still have cooties, apparently, to all the boys. But when I said to them, hey, I get to go to this amazing lunch with all of these fancy ladies. They're all going to get dressed up. They're going to buy purses. What do you want me to tell them? One little kid raised his hand and said, tell them I matter. Another one said, I just want to be proud of myself. And the hands kept raising, and out came the most profound things out of the mouth of babes. They just want you to look at them and to see them and not clutch your pearls or grab your purse and go to the other side. None of them want your pity. They want you to believe in them, that they came here to become new Americans, to have a better life, to have a second chance, to have that opportunity to pick up a plastic champagne glass and to make a toast for change. That's all they want. My favorite little girl was raising her hand and she got tired, so she actually held both hands up, and I picked on her and she said, my foot went to sleep. So that actually has nothing to do with any of you, except it does. That young kids can say anything about belief, about second chances, about being visible, about mattering. And I think that's why each and every one of you are here. What I realized when I maxed out those credit cards standing at that bookstore is I'd make that money back. I could bake cookies for my family for Christmas. But when I saw a little girl come to me carrying her most prized possession, a book, a $4.99 book, a little girl who had never sat on her daddy's lap and read books because he was rotting in a cell. This little girl came up to me like it was her most prized possession, as if it was a Coach or Chanel purse. And she looked at me and she said, "Miss G, is there any way that we can order this book in Spanish?" And I said, "Sure, honey, how come?" And she said, "Because my mama wants to read about the little girl that changed my life." Changed her life. So each and every one of you have the opportunity today to help change lives, to change lives in your community, to change lives of kids who need that second chance. 150 kids walked into my life, and they're still there. Each and every one of those kids graduated, the first in their families. Each and every one of those kids went to college, the first in their families. And each and every one of those kids that hated teachers, ironically, they're all becoming teachers. That's their profession. They're getting like PhDs and masters and surpassing me. And they're teaching at the schools that they went to. They're teaching at the schools that they were kicked out of. So little boys can walk into a room and see students like Sherrod and say, "I look like him. I talk like him. I come from where he comes from, and I don't have to hit a ball over a fence or slam dunk a ball in a basket or get up on MTV and rap to America to make it. Maybe all I have to do is to go to school, to find my place in the world, to find my voice." So today is really a celebration of finding those voices. I am so honored and so privileged to meet so many voices in your community. And if you have me back, I'll come, because now I'm invested. I want to see those fourth graders become fifth graders. I want to see those kids at Benjamin Franklin go to North. I want to see those kids come back and become Bison. I got a sweatshirt today. I can't wait to put it on. I know we're going for a three-peat, so I want to wear my sweatshirt with pride. But I want to be a part of this community, because just like Narada, this community feels like home, and this community feels like hope. So thank you for an ordinary teacher telling a story about extraordinary kids. But there are extraordinary kids right here, right now, who need you as well. So thank you. I need to sneak off the stage. As my students would say, "You're about to do the ugly cry, Miss G. Get off before you embarrass us." So I'm going to sneak off with my hanky, sit in the corner and cry, and thank you for this amazing experience.